Minecraft 1.21.6 is not only the Chase the Skies drop, but also brings us Data Pack version 80 and Resource Pack version 63 with a new dialogue system, and much more. My name is Sliced Lime, and this is a guide to all the changes. Let's start with the pack versions. All JSON files in both the data and resource packs are now read in strict mode. This means some files that worked before but were not correct JSON syntax, like for instance having trailing commas, will no longer work. Version information is now available in the game. On the client side, this is accessed by pressing F3 and V, which prints the client-side version information. On the server side, it's accessed using a new version command. This command takes no parameters and returns no value, it simply prints the version information. Another new utility for managing pack versions is the new Data Pack Create subcommand. This can be used to automatically create the scaffolding files needed for a new data pack. The command is followed by the ID of the pack and then the name text component. The created pack will have a supported version that is equal to that of the game. Using the ride command to mount a ghast, ender dragon or giant now moves the third-person camera further out, just like for the happy ghast. Some command fixes in this version as well. The set block and fail commands are now back to updating the redstone power of blocks properly. Playing sounds with the play sound command now properly accounts for players being in different dimensions. And there is now a UI sound category available for the play sound command. And the set world spawn command no longer ignores the specified angle. This version also adds the waypoint command. This command can be used to list waypoints as well as modify the color and shape of waypoints. The color can be set with two forms, either color or color hex, to set a color. The basic form takes a named color like red or blue, while the hex form takes a 6-hex color code like those used in web formats. The waypoint style subcommand is followed by either the ID of a waypoint style asset or reset. Waypoint style assets are JSON files in the waypoint style asset directory, which contain near and far distances as well as the sprites list. Sprites in this list are located in the HUD/locator_bar sprite folder, and one is selected depending on where between the near and far distances the waypoint is. The first one if the waypoint is at or closer than the near distance. The last one if the waypoint is at or further than the far distance. And one in between picked linearly otherwise. At least one sprite is required. There are two built-in styles, default and bowtie. That command does not control which entities show up as waypoints, however. That is instead controlled by two new attributes. The waypoint transmit range attribute controls how far away the waypoint of an entity is seen. The default is 60 million for players and 0 for all other entity types. The waypoint receive range attribute controls how far away waypoints are shown for a player. This attribute only exists for players and also defaults to 60 million. Another new attribute is the camera distance attribute. This specifies the distance and defaults to 4. The final distance to the camera is also multiplied by the scale attribute. The effective camera distance of a player also inherits the camera distance of any mount, if that is larger than the one for the player. The minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 32. Ghasts and happy ghasts now have the flying speed attribute that modifies their flying speed. Speaking of attributes, there is a new field for entries in the attribute modifier's item component. That field is display, and it is an object with a type that is one of default, hidden or override. Default shows the attribute modifier just like before. Hidden shows no tooltip entry at all for that attribute modifier, and override replaces the shown text with the contents of a field called value, which is a text component. The painting variant component now requires that its target is a registered variant in the painting variant registry, and can no longer accept inline painting variant definitions. The equipable component has two new fields, a can be sheared boolean and a shearing sound event ID. Let's move on to entity and data news. All mobs now have two new fields called home pos and home radius. These are only serialized if the radius is a positive value. Mobs with a home position and radius set will limit any pathfinding query to within the indicated area. although they may still start moving repeatedly and move slightly. Some mobs, like bats, slimes, magma cubes, phantoms, and ender dragons may also ignore it. The home position might be changed by riding a mob or interacting with them with a lead. TNT entities now have an owner field. This field is optional, and if set, it is the UUID of a living entity and denotes who lit it, which is also who will be credited with any kills. Vexes now also have an owner field, which is similarly the UUID of a mob. Mobs that transform like a zombie turning into a drowned will now retain any custom data component set in the data field. And entities spawning from beehives now once again filter out any equipment and sleeping position data. A bug with the particle color field for area effect clouds that made it read-only has been fixed, and the particle field overall has been renamed to Custom Particle. Drowned have been fixed, so when they have can break doors set to 1, they now actually break doors. In equipment news, the body and saddle slots now work more consistently for players. Their contents is cleared with the clear command, it stays if you die with the keep inventory game rule on, and the prevent equipment drop enchantment effect now works for those slots. There's also a new statistic in this version, Happy Gast 1 cm, which shows up as distance by Happy Gast. There's a new advancement trigger called Player Shared Equipment. There are two possible conditions, item for the item that is shared off, and entity for the entity that was shared. Let's move on to dialogues. This is a new type of custom user interface for data packs and custom servers, based on a new experimental registry of dialog content, which can also be specified inline in the new dialog command. Dialogs are simple modals, that is, they take over the input for the screen until they are dismissed. They're meant to provide a custom way to describe simple user interface, rather than a way to create any user interface in the game. As such, the feature is intentionally limited to match that use case. To avoid users mixing them up with the actual game user interface, dialog screens are marked with a warning sign next to their titles. Clicking on that warning leads to a screen explaining that what you're seeing is custom content, and it also gives the user a way to exit the world if they become locked in a loop of dialogues. For custom servers, dialogs are available already in the configuration phase, which is generally during the connecting loading screen. However, at that point, all dialogs have to be specified inline since registries have not finished loading. There are a number of ways to display dialogs, including from the pause menu and using the new dialog command. Closing the dialog, regardless of how, will cause the user to go back to whatever their last open non-dialog screen was. The new dialog command can be used to show or hide the dialogs. Dialog show is followed by the player targets and the dialog, either as a namespaced ID of the dialog in a data pack or the inline data of the dialog itself. And dialog clear will close any visible dialogs for the given target. Another way to show dialogs is through the pause menu. This replaces the previous server links feature, and the new button is placed according to the same rules. The label for a dialog button in the pause menu is specified in its external title field, and it shows up depending on the pause screen additions dialog tag. If that tag has a single element, that button will now show instead of the send feedback and report bugs buttons. If it has multiple elements, the pause screen will have a button that leads to the Minecraft custom options dialog, which by default lets you select one of the tag elements. There is now a new keybind to open a Quick Actions dialog screen. The default key is G, and the behavior is configured by the Quick Actions dialog tag. If that tag has a single element, that dialog is immediately opened. If it has multiple, the built-in Quick Actions dialog is opened instead, which by default has buttons for all the tag elements. And if it has no elements, the keybind does nothing. So what are dialogs? Most dialogs follow a common layout, but the exact contents depends on which type it is, and we'll look at all the types in a moment. The general layout starts with a header with the title and the warning button. That's followed by the body elements, which are things like labels, input boxes, buttons, and so on, which will be scrollable if it's too long to fit. And then finally, there may or may not be a footer. The various types of dialogues have a type field that determines which other fields they have, but there are some common fields that are common between most types. They are the title field, which is a text component which is always visible on screen. The external title field, which is the name of any button that displays the dialogue, also in form of a text component. Dialogs can control whether the game is paused when they open in single player. This is done through a pause boolean field available for all dialog types. The default is true. Can close with escape is an optional boolean which does what it says on the tin, with a default value of true. You can also control what happens when an action is taken in the dialogue through the after action field. The default value is close, which closes the dialogue. Another option is none, which keeps the screen open. In order to not lock the game forever, this option is only available when the pause field is set to false. And finally, you can also set it to wait for response, which replaces the current dialogue with a waiting for response screen. This is intended for laggy connections where you don't want a double action to happen. If no new dialogue is shown after 5 seconds, a back button will become available. This value applies regardless of how an action is taken in a dialogue, including from clicking a button or a click event in a text component. The body field is a body element or list of body elements making up the dialogue. Think of this as the text that is displayed before anything else in the body. Although it can be made out of multiple instances of body types, which can currently be text messages and items. The plain message body type shows a multi-line message. It has a contents field for the contents, which is a text component, and a width field that limits the maximum width of the message, with a default of 200. The other body type is the item type, which is an item with an optional description. The item is rendered as if it was in an inventory slot. Which item to draw is set in the item field, and how it is shown is controlled by the show decorations boolean, which determines whether the stack count and damage bars should show, with true as the default. The show tooltip field controls whether a tooltip should show if the item is hovered, also with a default of true. The description field is either a text component to show next to the item or an object in the plain message body type format with contents and width fields. And finally, the item type also has width and height fields with a default of 16, but changing these does not scale the item, only the display area for it. After the body text, the dialog can have input fields. The inputs field contains a list of inputs to display. Each input control has a key which is used when the data is submitted. This must be a valid macro argument form, which means made up of letters, digits, and underscore characters. Each input control also has a type field which specifies what type it is and thereby also what other fields it has. Text input controls ask for whatever text the player wants to input, which is then submitted without modification. They have width fields, which is the width of the input field, or by default 200. The label field is a text component to show as a label in front of the control. Label visible is a boolean that controls whether the label should be shown, by default true. And initial contains a string describing what should show in the input field when the dialog is shown. They also have a max length field, which defaults to 32. Text inputs also have a multi-line mode, activated by adding an object with multi-line settings, where you can set the amount of max lines or the exact height of the box. The boolean input type shows a checkbox. It also has a label field for the text displayed to the right, and an initial field for the initial value, which in this case is a boolean. The onTrue and onFalse string fields contain what value to submit, which defaults to the string forms of true and false. The single option input type shows a button that cycles between options when clicked, and submits the selected value. It has label, label visible, and width fields just like the text type, but instead of displaying the label separately, it is displayed on the button as a prefix. The options field contains a list of options, where each option has an ID field with the string to send if that option is selected when submitting. The display field contains a text component to display. If the display is not set, the ID is used instead. Options can also have an initial boolean, which flags which option to show by default. Only one option can have that set to true. There's also a simple format of options represented as strings, in which case that string is both the ID and the display. And finally, the number range input type is a slider for picking a number in some range, which then submits the selected value. If it's a whole number, it will be sent without a decimal point. It has a label text component field for the slider label, but also a label format field which specifies a translation key which is used when composing the final content. The first argument to this translation string is the label, the second is the value. And the default key is options.generic_value. The width field sets the width of the slider, which by default is 200. Start sets the leftmost possible value, and end sets the rightmost possible value, which can then be moved between in an increment determined by the step field, specifying the size of the step. This field is also optional, and if omitted, lets the user pick any value down to the number of pixels on the screen. The initial field has the initial value of the slider, which is then moved to the left and right based on the step. This value must be in range and defaults to the middle of the range if not set. Finally, all types of dialogs have at least some form of actions. An action is specified as an object with a label field for the text component shown on the button. The width field sets the width of the button with a default of 150. And the tooltip field can contain a text component to display whenever the button has keyboard highlight or is hovered. The action also has an action field, which contains a typed object representing what happens when the button is clicked. Actions can reuse click events from text components, but the action field of the click event is instead used as type. All of the existing click event actions are available this way except open file. There are also two dynamic action types, the dynamic/run command and dynamic/custom action types. Dynamic/run command will build a command to run using a provided macro template in the template field. The macro will be expanded using the string form of values in the inputs, replacing their IDs. If that resulting command needs elevated permissions, a confirmation box will show before running the command. Any inputs that are not used in the macro are ignored, and any macro parameters that don't have a matching input will be replaced with an empty string. The dynamic/custom action type sends a custom packet to the server using an ID from the ID field. The contents of the packet is an NBT compound with keys and values representing the values of the inputs from the dialog. That means that Boolean values are sent as a 0 or 1 byte instead of their string forms, and number range inputs are sent as a float instead of text. There's also an optional additions field for any static data to append to the compound. This is intended as an alternative to commands for custom servers and does nothing on vanilla servers. Let's get into the dialog types. The notice dialog type shows a message and has a single action in the footer. This action is specified in an action field, or a simple OK button if none is specified. The confirmation dialog type shows a message in the body and has two actions in the footer, set in a yes and a no field. A multi-action dialog shows a scrollable list of actions arranged in columns. It also has a footer with a cancel or back button. The actions field is a list of at least one action, which will be arranged in a number of columns specified in the columns field. The exit action field is an optional action. If that is present, it will cause a button to show up in the footer and also be the action taken when the user presses the escape key. The server links dialog type shows a list of links received from the server arranged in columns. The screen has the same columns and exit action fields as the multi-action type, but instead of actions, this dialog type has a button width field that determines the width of all the buttons. Dialog list dialogs show a list of buttons that lead to other dialogs arranged in columns. The title of each button is determined by the external title field of those dialogs. Like the previous one, this dialog type also has exit action, columns, and button width fields, and in addition it also has a dialogs field, which is a dialog, list of dialogs, or hash prefixed dialog tag. And that's all for the dialogs, but there are related changes to text components as well. To begin with, there's a new custom click event, which sends a custom click action packet to the server, which, like mentioned before, has no functionality on vanilla servers. The fields for this click event are ID and payload, where payload contains the values to send in the NBT compound. There's also a new show dialog click event, which opens a dialog specified in the dialog field when the player clicks on that text component. A change to run command click events as well. Like for dialogs, if the command requires elevated permissions to run, the user will now see a confirmation screen before the command is run. A couple of sound events have been renamed. They are entity.leashNot.place and .break, which are now instead called item.lead.tide and .untide, and block.sand.wind, which is now block.drygrass.ambient, and of course a whole list of added sound events. In tag news, the place ambient desert block sounds block tag has been renamed to triggers ambient desert sand block sounds. A new block tag has been added for triggers ambient desert dry vegetation block sounds. The Happy Ghast Avoids tag for blocks that happy ghasts try to avoid getting close to, and the triggers ambient dried ghast block sounds tag for blocks that cause ambient dried ghast sounds to play when a dried ghast block is placed on them. There are 3 new item tags, a collection tag for all harnesses, as well as Happy Ghast Food and Tempt item tags. And 2 new entity type tags, Can Equip Harness and Followable Friendly Mobs. And in custom world news, dimension types can now define a new optional field called Cloud Height, which defines both at which height clouds render and at which height happy ghasts heal. And in resource pack news, Unifont has been updated to 16.0.03, and some previously omitted Unifont glyphs for private use areas have been added. Those glyphs are loaded as a separate subfont called Minecraft:include/Unifont PUA, and are not included in any normally used font. For the Unihex font provider, the size overrides field is now optional and defaults to an empty list if omitted. There is now a new Happy Ghast body layer type for equipment assets, rendering in the body slot of Happy Ghasts. Item models now have a top-level oversized in GUI field, which is false by default. Setting it to true causes that item to overflow from the slot it is in rather than be cut by the edges of that slot. Player head items now have a new model type called Player Head, which handles asynchronous loading of profile textures. The profile field on the other head item model type has been removed, and the profiles are now only supported for the player head model type. There's also a change to the format for block models, where the rotation angle is no longer limited to multiples of 22.5 degrees, and can now be any angle representable as a float from -45 to +45 degrees. Panorama textures must now all match in size and be square. Mob effects no longer have their own atlas, they are instead included in the main user interface sprite atlas and can now also use the scaling parameter available for UI sprites. The clouds texture can no longer be colored. And the game now consistently respects blur texture parameters set in MC meta files of PNG files. The rest of the changes in this version are related to shaders, and we'll get into those with a reminder that overriding core shaders is not a supported feature. All built-in uniforms are now uniform blocks instead of opaque loose uniforms. Custom uniforms provided to post-process shaders are now uniform blocks as well, and uniform definitions in post-process JSON files are now per block. In post-process shader definitions, entries in the targets map have been extended. There's a new optional persistent field, which is a boolean that can be set to true for that target to be persistent across frames, although it is still cleared if the window is resized. The default value is false. Another new option for target definitions is clear color, which is an ARGB color specified as a packed integer, or a 4-float array ordered RGBA, and represents the color written to the target when it is cleared. The default is all transparent black. The uniforms list is now a list per block instead of a global list. The order of the list in each block must match the order in the shader. The name field is now unused, although it's still recommended to set it for readability. The values field has been replaced by value as part of a uniform definition and is now a typed object. Note that uniform blocks are not validated with shaders. Giving incorrect information will cause some form of undefined and definitely wrong behavior. Post-process shaders now also have uniforms grouped into uniform blocks that are set according to the definition file and can be shared across both vertex and fragment shaders. The list of sizes that were previously vec2 uniforms named a prefix and a size are now replaced with a single sampler info uniform block. There's also a Globals uniform block available to most shaders with screen size, glint alpha, game time, and menu blur radius uniforms. The Fog uniform block is available to most shaders and contains all the uniforms related to the fog. The Projection uniform block is available to most shaders and contains the projection matrix. The Lighting uniform block is also available to most shaders and contains the direction vectors for the two lights. The Dynamic Transforms uniform block is now only available to the shaders that normally use it, and contains the model view matrix and other model-related uniforms, and is very likely to change in the near future. The Cloud Info uniform block is only available to cloud shaders and contains the color, offset, and cell size of clouds. And the Lightmap Info uniform block is only available to the Lightmap shader and contains a bunch of light and lightmap related uniforms. There are also a number of specific blocks for specific shaders shown on screen now. And that's it for these pack versions. Thank you for watching. If you're a fellow nerd who actually appreciated all of this stuff, then please take just one moment to click a button under the video, because these are a huge effort to make, and they easily drown in the YouTube algorithm. My name is Sly Slime, and I'll see you next time.